Kathy, I can't hear you.
Good evening. We'd like to welcome everybody to the NSW OCC and the Walk Institute webinar series. Can you hear me, Karen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. My name's Catherine Harley. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for NSW OCC, and we'd like to welcome you this evening to an educational webinar called The Evolution of Linen, Mastering the Microclimate to Reduce Skin Injuries. And just before we get started, I'll introduce you to our speakers, but I would like to say a thank you to MIP and specifically Megan Clark for supporting this webinar, not financially in any way, but rather by supporting and helping to facilitate the discussions and really giving the speakers support to be able to get their presentations together with very busy schedules. So thank you very much, Megan. I'd like to introduce our two speakers for this evening. We will have two speakers, and what we're going to do is have their presentations, and then we'll have questions at the very end. So our first speaker is Dr. Karen Campbell, and Karen is an RN, PhD, and an NSWOC. She's adjunct faculty. She was adjunct faculty for the Clinical Science of Wound Healing program at Western University in London, and she is currently the president of the International Skin Tear Advisory Panel, ISTAP. She has functioned as an advanced practice nurse in wound care, continence, and finished the NSWOC program last year. She is on faculty at the RNAO Wound Care Institute and has been the co-chair of the RNAO Best Practice Guidelines on Pressure Injuries and the Canadian Best Practice Guidelines on Pressure Ulcer Prevention and Treatment in Spinal Cord Injury Populations. Karen is well known to all of us. She's very well published, and she has a really strong interest in skin health and frequently publishes on the topic. Our second speaker is Laura Roth. She's a registered nurse, master's prepared registered nurse, and certified NSWOC. Laura is also a nurse continence advisor, and she's practiced the last 23 years as a continence clinical nurse specialist, seeing patients with continence issues both in clinics and hospital settings. But now she's currently semi-retired, but works part-time as a clinical nurse specialist with 2 urologists, and she's also the lead academic advisor for the Wound Ostomy Continence Institute Continence Program, which is run under the NSWOCC. And so what I'd like to do, we're going to start with Karen, and then she will turn things over to Laura, and then we'll have an interactive question session at the very end, as I mentioned earlier. So Karen, I'm turning things over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm just going to ask, there's a few of you who have your mics open. If you could just mute your mic, and someone's got a video link on, if you could shut that down, that would be great. And so Laura and I, hopefully we have a very interesting presentation. What we're going to be covering this evening, we're going to discuss how linen and fabric technology is really evolving to support microclimate management and safe patient handling. We're going to review evidence regarding the risks that inappropriate use of continence products and linen pose both to patients, residents, and to nurses. Laura's going to be talking about one hospital's efforts to change practice to ensure appropriate use of incontinent products and linen. We're going to be reviewing cost of patient, resident, and staff injuries when appropriate patient-resident handling is not done. And we're going to learn from each other related to what you've been able to do in your own practice and measures that you've used to improve your practice in this area. So I'm going to be starting with microclimate and how this impacts pressure injuries. And I know for many of you this is going to be a review, but I just want to set the standard so that when we start talking more about microclimate and linen, you can understand where we're coming from. So we know that skin properties are influenced by several intrinsic and extrinsic factors. For example, temperature, humidity, and airflow next to the skin surface. And I'm going to just ask again, some people have their microphones on. If you could please mute them, because we're getting a lot of background noise. Thank you. And so we know that the concept of microclimate is now seen as being an important factor in pressure injury development. 15 years ago, there was a little bit of talk about microclimate, but it wasn't as important. And it's generally accepted today that microclimate management is really important in the prevention of pressure injuries. So the structure and function of skin play a key role in pressure injury susceptibility and development. And we now have more evidence from some studies and from some animal studies to show how microclimate affects skin properties, and more research in terms of how this impacts pressure injury development is being done right now. There's being work done in Europe, there's work being done in Japan, in Israel, but the optimal microclimate environment at the skin surface and how this can be achieved really remains unknown at this time, but stay tuned because the science is evolving. And you see I have a picture there of someone with very, very dry skin, and you can imagine how that impacts how the skin functions and how that increases the risk for someone developing a pressure injury. We know that the skin surface is an intermediate temperature between the environment and the body's core temperature. And you also know, and this is not new information from really for anybody, that there are regional variations around the body. And so as you go more distally, either for feet or hands, the body temperature tends to cool. And temperatures in high-risk pressure injury skin areas can vary. So for example, surface temperature on the heel can be around 29 degrees centigrade, but on the sacrum around 31 degrees centigrade. And so you can see that there are variations. But skin temperature is also impacted by the environment. You can see the picture on the right side. This was London, maybe this was 5 years ago, when we had received 153 centimeters of snow about this time of the year over a few days. And so it was very cold and windy. We got a lot of lake effect snow. As you can well imagine, increasing or decreasing environmental temperatures cause an increase or a decrease skin temperature. And if the skin temperature is increased, then there's vasodilation. And if the skin temperature is decreased, you have vasoconstriction. Well, this is all just a very brief review for everyone. We also know that humidity plays a huge role in terms of skin. And across our country, for example, in places like Alberta, we have low humidity, but on the coast, we have high humidity. And we know that the higher the humidity, that increases the hydration within the stratum corneum. But on the other hand, a low relative humidity decreases the stratum corneum hydration. And increased stratum corneum hydration increases absorption and penetration of irritants, which can increase your risk for either an allergic dermatitis or a contact dermatitis. And you can see how relevant this is when you're thinking about your patients who have bowel and or bladder incontinence, who may be exposed to fistula drainage, who may be exposed to products that are put on their skin that could potentially cause a contact dermatitis or even a allergic dermatitis. So a high proportion of humidity leads to plastinization of the keratinocytes. And you can see from my picture, this is an extreme example of someone who has a lot of maceration in their heel. This is a patient who's had a venous leg ulcer, and the wound drainage is running down their leg and going into their socks and footwear. But what happens to the stratum corneum when you have a high proportion of humidity? The stratum corneum stiffness decreases. The other things that decrease are the elasticity and the mechanical strength. So therefore, the skin is not as elastic, it's not able to stretch and respond, it's not as strong. And if you think about extreme cases of exposure and overhydration, you have maceration. And if you have that on the skin, you can literally peel the skin off with your nail, with an instrument, and you can very easily remove the layers of the skin. On the opposite side, if you've got dry skin, you have an increased stiffness of the epidermis. And so too wet is not good, and too dry is not good. And when the epidermis is stiffer, it increases the susceptibility of the skin to mechanical damage. It can cause cracks and fissures and inflammation. And again, you can see then with these cracks and fissures, you've lost the barrier function of the skin. The other thing that happens with increased stiffness is reduced soft tissue deformation. And normally, if you think about your tissue over a bony prominence, I'm sitting in my office in a desk chair, and the soft tissue around my two ischial tuberosities is deforming around those two bony prominences. But if my stratum corneum is stiffer, it's not able to do that as well, and you have localized underlying stress and an increased risk for tissue injury. And why, we get concerned about dry heel skin and how it is associated with heel pressure injuries in the right conditions. And so I've talked about moisture, and now I'm going to talk about heat and what the impact is on the skin. So increasing skin temperature results in a general decline of cutaneous resistance. So think about your patients who are febrile. And increased skin temperature seems to increase cutaneous stiffness under pressure and decreases the epidermal adhesion. And this then puts your patients at risk for a blister, and their skin is not then able to deform as well over a bony prominence. And this is very relevant to patients who could be in hospital or at home or in long-term care. They're febrile, maybe their skin is dry as well. And they are at higher risk for developing blisters and pressure injuries. So animal experiments have been done, and they indicate a greater chance of developing a pressure injury, and the greater chance that pressure injury is going to be more severe as the body temperature goes up. And it also indicates that with low temperature, you have an increase of the tissue stiffness, increasing the susceptibility to skin damage as well. And I've got a picture here of Goldilocks, and it's the skin has to be the right moisture content, and it has to be the right temperature. Too wet is no good, too dry is no good, too hot or too cool are again problems. So it's finding that correct balance between body temperature as well as moisture. So I'm going to turn it over to Laura now. I'm going to mute my mic. Laura's going to take over, but I'm going to be forwarding her slides.
Thanks, Karen. So why should we be concerned about incontinence products and linen use? So my question to all of you is, how many of you have seen seniors being placed in incontinence products inappropriately? Have you ever wondered if this has caused any harm to especially the seniors? Have you ever seen many linen layers on especially hospital beds? And I wouldn't be surprised if all of you said yes to all of these questions. So the research does show that the use of an incontinence brief in the hospital for seniors who are previously continent, that would be continent at home, of course, is strongly and significantly linked to self-report of new urinary incontinence on discharge. So in other words, our seniors come into the hospital continent, but they're likely to leave as incontinent. And incontinence product use is linked to pressure injuries, depression, and functional dependency. And incontinence pads are used unnecessarily for especially hospitalized older adults. Next slide. So layers and pressure injury risk. We do know that pressure, shear, friction, and microclimate, and that would be the temperature and moisture, as Karen talked about earlier, are strongly associated with skin breakdown. Adding layers under the patient can increase interface pressure and risk for shear. And traditional layering can decrease the effectiveness of the therapeutic surface's ability to redistribute pressure and sustain skin's microclimate. So in my experience, staff, including nursing staff, do not realize the risk of adding layers underneath the patients. And in fact, my experience as a nurse is us nurses want to keep the patient clean, and we want to keep the bed clean or the linen clean. In my traditional layering, what I mean by this is in the hospital that I used to work at, the hospitals were pre-made by housekeeping with fitted sheets, reusable underpads, plus often many layers on top of that. And that seemed to be a routine. Plus the patient could have an incontinence brief on. So there's many layers underneath our patients. Next slide. So the slide on the left shows the major sites of friction in a patient sitting in a bed with the head of the bed elevated. So you can see in red the various sites of friction. And in the slide on the right, it shows the shear plus the pressure plus the friction can certainly cause ischemia. Next slide. So what is the effect of the various linen layers on pressure redistribution? And I'd like all of you to think about, how do these specialty beds that we have in hospitals work to help decrease interface pressure? Decreasing the interface pressure on specialty beds is done by maximizing both the immersion and the envelopment. So if you look at the picture on the upper right, shows immersion, or the depth of penetration into a surface. And the envelopment is the contact area for a level of immersion. So you can see on the bottom right, you've got a person's body there. It needs to be both enveloped and immersed into the bed surface. So what I'm basically trying to tell you is that the improper layer selection can inhibit the mattress's ability to conform around the patient and redistribute pressure. So when us as nurses put many layers on the bed, we actually make these beds less effective. Next slide. So this chart shows you the peak sacral pressures with various linen layers and at various degrees of head of bed elevation. So 0, 30, 45 degrees of head elevation. So you can see on the right-hand side, we're measuring peak sacral pressure. And on the bottom, you look at various linens on the bed. So you see 35 millimeters of mercury pressure with a fitted sheet. And then when you add the fitted sheet plus a quilted chucks, now that's an old-fashioned term that even I, as an old nurse, wasn't quite sure what quilted chucks was, but I do believe it's the reusable underpad. A fitted sheet and a slider sheet, you can see the peak sacral pressure goes up. A fitted sheet and a breathable disposable pad, plus then finally 6 layers of layers on top of the bed, and how that increases the peak sacral pressure. Next slide. I think that's Karen.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about more about occlusive materials and a little bit more about what the research is showing us about bedding and linens. So many of you have expertise in wound healing, and you know from your dressing selection that when you have an occlusive dressing or you have occlusive material, you have little to no breathability. So as you can well imagine, then you have an accumulation of both moisture and heat on the skin surface. And I've talked about what the impact of that is on the skin. And so we want to look at then less occlusive materials that are more breathable. And if you think about that, they have less of a negative impact on the skin. And so they are more breathable, the moisture level is reduced, there is less heat accumulation, and that ends up having a positive impact on the skin. So just to review again, we know that soft tissue deformation causes pressure injuries. And Laura showed you with her example how the therapeutic surfaces that we use, the mattresses that we use, what happens is that the patient's body is immersed and enveloped into that surface, therefore reducing the risk for a pressure injury. And we know that if that tissue it does not do that, you're at higher risk for developing a pressure injury. We also know that skin humidity and temperature do not cause pressure injuries, but what they do is they cause soft tissue deformation. So the microclimate affects the soft tissue deformation, our ability of our skin, of our tissue to be flexible, to be able to be strong. And that is how it impacts pressure injuries. It's regarded then as an effect modifier or an indirect risk factor for pressure injuries. So let's think now about the clinical relevance here. And so of clinical relevance is the direct and positive association between humidity and the stratum corneum and hydration and friction. And Laura's spoken to you about friction and how friction impacts shear and how that in combination with pressure causes pressure injuries. But the association is not linear. And so skin friction is particularly high when the skin is either too wet or too dry. And so again, we want skin moisture to be just right, not too wet, not too dry. We're starting to really look at special fabrics, and you can see on the bottom right-hand side, it's a picture of a spacer fabric. And if you look at your running shoes, and I've looked at my running shoes, they have these spacer fabrics in them. And they're specialized 3D textiles that really facilitate airflow and breathability, and you know they are great in terms of sports. But we actually are learning a lot about healthcare linens from the sports world, and so keep that thought in mind as I keep talking. So we know that the more the skin adheres to the contact layer, the greater the extent of the tissue deformation and shear. And the example here is someone who's has their head of bed up in a hospital bed. And their skin is sticking to the bed, but because the head of the bed up, they're sliding down in the bed and they have shearing going on. And there's been some research done with specialized modeling suggesting that wetness, skin aging, and skin wrinkles are all risk factors for skin lesions. And it's because of the increased friction, which then increases the shear. And Laura showed you that in one of the previous slides. And, you know, the main example is sliding down in bed, or the person is being repositioned and they're not lifted. They're dragged up and down, up or down the bed, and the skin is moist, either from sweat or from urine. And then you have increased friction, increased shear, and the potential for skin breakdown and pressure injuries. So how do we improve skin microclimate? We need to keep skin, I've said here, dry and cool, but we don't want it too dry and we don't want it too cool. We want it normal body temperature for the part of the body it is, knowing that there are regional differences. So as you go distally, the skin temperature on the surface is cooler. And you want, you know, the right sort of hydration. You don't want it too wet, you don't want it too dry. And we know that increased stratum corneum hydration increases friction, and that is not a good thing. And so we want to keep skin at normal hydration. This is just an interesting little bit of information. There are wearable now sensors that are being tested in the United States that are constantly monitoring skin temperature, pressure, as well as relative humidity on the skin. And the system is for individuals that you would put on your body for prevention of pressure injuries. And it would either alert the patient or the caregiver that there's either too much pressure or there's an adverse microclimate. And you can see actually from the picture, you know, the size of the sensor. And so they are getting quite small, and I think we're going to be seeing some of these monitoring systems that we can use to help tell us when we potentially have a problem. So I said I was going to talk a little bit more about linen and what we've learned from the sports world and how we can then apply that to healthcare. And, you know, we often have to learn from other divisions of science and then apply it to our own clinical practice. So we know that breathability is very important. And for people who are involved in wound care, we talk a lot about moisture vapor transmission rate. We often talk about that in relationship to dressings, but I'm going to be talking about that in relationship to linen. So moisture vapor transmission rate is a measure of the passage of water vapor through a substance. And you already know that if the skin is too wet, that is not good for the microclimate. And there's been tests that have been done that show that some polyester linen offers a 9% increase in breathability compared to your traditional polycotton sheet. So that's important. You have increased breathability. We also know that moisture wicking is important. We need to wick moisture away. And so polyester wicks moisture away from the skin 20% faster than a traditional polycotton sheet. And the wicking distance is 27% more effective than a traditional polycotton sheet. As well, the absorbency is 7% more effective than a traditional polycotton sheet. So there's more wicking away of that excess moisture. It's getting it farther away from the skin, and it's absorbing some of the moisture as it's wicking it away and getting it off the skin. The other thing that we have to think about are, do the linens cause friction and therefore impact shear? So we want fabrics that have low pilling. You all know about pilling in your clothing. If you've got pilling in your own linen, you have the potential for friction. And we want fabrics that have low abrasion testing results, and fabrics then that are smooth on the surface, and they virtually eliminate any potential for friction and actually help to reduce shear. The other thing that we want is we want improved stretch. So we want four-way stretch. So Laura spoke about the mattresses, the pressure redistribution mattresses that the patients or residents need to be immersed and enveloped in. And if you've got a very tight cotton or polycotton sheet that has no give, the patient or resident is then not sinking into the mattress. And so if you look at some linens, they have improved stretch. So 50% increase in stretch in the length and 73% in the width compared to polycotton sheets. And it really then does help with a stretch. That in combination with a fabric that's very smooth then reduces friction, reduces shearing, allows for envelopment and immersion. And so what do you need to look for in linens? You want a thin profile that works well with your pressure redistribution mattress. You want it to be breathable, so no excess heat or moisture, and I've spoken about that. You need it to stay on the bed. It will make your work life easier, and it will stay on the bed so the patient's not lying directly on the mattress. It needs to have to cover a large portion of the body. It needs to support the heaviest portion of the body, but it has to be comfortable for the patient. And it needs to stay in place without bunching or wrinkles, which could be then potential pressure points under the patients. Now I'm going to turn it over to Laura again, and she's going to be carrying on with the presentation.
Thanks, Karen. So, whoopsie.
Oops.
There we are. That's better. So I'd like to share with you some experience that I've had, and this is one hospital only, and it's only an example. It was my former hospital that I used to work in, and the message was basically to staff, we're trying to figure out how to improve linen and incontinence product practice. And I happen to notice my former NSWAC colleague is listening in tonight, so I'm sure she'll correct me if I say anything wrong. But anyway, so I was involved with this project in a hospital. It was recognized we were overusing incontinence products and the layers of linen. And I don't think that the average nurse or allied health recognized that the overuse of these products can actually harm patients. We have evidence now that the overuse of these products and layers of linen can increase the risk of becoming incontinent, functionally dependent, and depressed. And it does increase the risk for development of pressure injuries and incontinence-associated dermatitis. So caregivers work to limit the number of layers between the patient and the bed surface. And our slogan was less is best. Next slide. And by less is best, what I mean is the fewer layers between the patient and the bed surface is best. So what we did is we tried to partner with patient care units one at a time, starting with rehab, and I can show you some of their examples. And we actually created a team that included, which I feel is very important, interprofessional champions. So in other words, it's not just nursing's role to reduce the layers, but we felt that nursing, especially allied health, such as occupational therapy and physiotherapy, personal support workers, and most importantly, or pretty importantly anyway, was the housekeeping staff. So we worked with each patient unit, and each patient unit identified their champions, and each patient unit made their own decisions. So I'll show you on a couple of slides that not every unit was the same. So some of our goals were to reduce the use of full incontinence briefs by 5%. We did find through earlier surveys that we were overusing incontinence briefs. We wanted to reduce the use of underpads by 10%. And we wanted to increase the use of incontinence body-worn pads by 5%. What I mean by that is the pads that you would wear inside your underwear. So we wanted to increase their use as compared to complete incontinence briefs or diapers. So in general, we found that beds were all padded up with the maximum linen. Housekeeping made up all the beds, in a routine. There was no assessment done by professional staff as to the linen needs for a specific patient. So in other words, the beds were made up routinely, and there was no assessment done as what does this particular patient need? And finally, patients who were continent were often put into incontinence products, especially our seniors. Next slide. So some of the decisions made on inpatient units were to create a standard bed making protocol for housekeeping staff, to increase the use of friction reducing linen, such as draw sheets and slider sheets for patients who needed assistance to reposition in bed. On some units made the decision to eliminate the pull-up briefs. I'm sure everybody knows what I mean by those. They are not absorbent really at all, and they're very costly. And so some of the units decided to eliminate those. And I do stress that only some of the units made this decision. And some of the units decided to stock 2 sizes of incontinence pads. So these are pads that a man or a woman would wear inside their own underwear. We encourage patients to bring their own underwear into the hospital, and we also stocked mesh underwear, and the gift shops stocked underwear for those that didn't have it. Next slide. Now, this is just one example, and I have to tell everybody this is several years old, so it's probably not the latest evidence. So this was a cardiovascular unit, and this is what they came up with for their linen selection guide. So you see that they've divided the patients into both ambulatory and non-ambulatory patients. The ambulatory patients are then divided into no assistant bed and then assistant bed. And then you can see on the non-ambulatory patients, there's no assistant bed, does need assistance, or requires mechanical lift. So it actually gives the staff the exact linen that they need on each of the beds. So for example, an ambulatory patient who does not need assistance to move in bed only has a fitted sheet on the bottom of the bed. And it would not be automatically made up with various layers underneath. So I won't go through this the entire, it's just one example of a linen selection guide. Next slide, please. So this is an example, once again, of containment. So it's an incontinence product selection guide. You would think that with the vast choice of the incontinence products that we can use today, that the use with each patient would be a simple choice. But in fact, we found that it was not so simple, and oftentimes nurses were reaching for whatever was closest. So you see here, the top part of the selection guide has the patient characteristics, so I'll just go through part of it. On the left-hand side, the ability to stand and balance to change a pad insert. It has dexterity and cognition to change their own pad, or needs minimal help to change their pad. And you can see that they needed their own snug fitting underwear or mesh pants. And there was 2 choices, a smaller pad and a bigger pad. So I won't go through the entire example, but once again, choosing incontinence products is not as easy as we often think. It is interesting, in thinking back, we found that patients who wanted just in case protection, I'm sure we all know those older patients who just say, oh, I want something just in case, would be put into a full brief. But once we got these pads, we found that people were put more appropriately into products. The other thing I'd like to say is that I do recall the nurses noting that with pads available, patients were up and mobile. And we know this is an issue with seniors, that we want them to get up and walking. And having a pad on as compared to a whole brief had them asking for assistance to the bathroom. Next slide. And finally, this is one final example, at least from the hospital that I was with. And once again, it's not perfect, but you can see the standard bed on a rehab unit, only a fitted sheet. So housekeeping knew that they were make the beds up only with a fitted sheet. Of course, there's a pillow and a top spread. And then nursing made the decision to add an underpad underneath, and that was if urine or stool regularly soaks through. And they're never to be used to lift or reposition. And the other thing we stressed was that blue pads or the disposable pads were never to be underneath a patient. And then I won't go through this whole slide, but once again, it's an example of a decision that one unit made. Next slide. So this is a different decision-making model for the right linens, for the right surface, and it's a detailed guide. So it's similar in some ways to the previously discussed guides in the sense that, once again, minimal linen is placed by housekeeping. Secondly, a clinical assessment has to be done of the individual patient needs as to what is needed on the bed. Slider sheets need to support the shoulders plus the buttocks of the patient, because this is the heaviest part of the patient, as Karen discussed. And we wanted to minimize the use of underpads. So once again, I will not go through the entire slide, but it's another example for all of you to look at and to understand. The next slide. So I'd like to change gears a little bit. And I'd like to talk about the risk to healthcare professionals using linen to reposition patients in bed or to transfer. So studies have shown that patient repositioning is one of the most physically demanding tasks that nurses mostly, but other healthcare professionals often help with, that we perform. So I'm hoping things have changed, but there has been an over-reliance on manual lifting in healthcare. And really, it's not a one-time effect, but it's a cumulative effect of repeated patient handling tasks over the career of a nurse, let's say. And it's interesting because they do say that musculoskeletal injury rates for healthcare rank the highest for our staff. That's above truck drivers, above laborers, above assemblers and janitors. So pulling a patient towards the head of the bed is one of the most significant causes of back injuries and pain in healthcare. And high levels of biomechanical stress on the caregiver's spines, shoulders, hands, and wrists. Next slide. So this is a slide that talks about the cost of musculoskeletal injuries due to patient handling. And this is just one hospital example. And these numbers, you can add to them because it's about 5 years old. So they do say that at the time, the average cost of a musculoskeletal injury, and this is just from patient handling, if the nurse needs to take time off work, was $11,000. The claim cost for a single severe injury was, as you can see, $440,000. So 1 year, there were 42 reported injuries and 43 days off work. And the average cost was over $14,000. And you can see this was mostly RN and RPNs. And the hospital that I used to work at said the cost would be much higher, but the hospital provides modified work. So injured nurses would come back on modified work, reducing the numbers of days, of lost days and costs associated with this. And there was on-site physiotherapists, physiotherapy for work-related injuries. Next slide. So this, I'd like to give you another example of other work that's been done across the country, and this is WorkSafe BC. And they did a study, and they did show that slider systems can reduce overall healthcare costs by keeping staff and patients safe. So a 2-part slider sheet system was designed by the ergonomic specialists and the laundry managers of Interior Health in BC. So the two parts consist of a slider draw sheet and a slider bottom sheet with a 20-inch panel of low friction, anti-static, breathable microfiber sewn lengthwise into the center of a jersey sheet. And the slider system components, which can remain under patients at all times, provide simple and accessible tools, which substantially reduce the physical demands placed on the nurses when manually repositioning patients in bed. Next slide. So this graph, once again, is from WorkSafe BC, and it is entitled "Slider Systems Can Reduce Overall Healthcare Costs by Keeping Staff and Patients Safe." So you see there is the coefficient on the friction on the left-hand side, and then across the bottom there are coefficients of friction with 4 different bed sheet systems. So on the left, the slider sheet system, you can see has the lowest coefficient of friction. And then there's a slider draw sheet with a jersey bottom, and then a soaker pad with a slider bottom. And then you can see how high the coefficient system is with the traditional sheet makeup. Next slide. So this is WorkSafe BC again, and what it does is it shows the cost savings with using the new linen. And this is both the claim costs and the time loss specific, once again, to bed repositioning activities. So you can see that it divides the savings both in acute care and residential care. So in acute care, the claim costs in 2010 and 11 were over 196,000. And then the claim costs reduced to 95,000 approximately after the implementation of this bedding. And then you see the average number of days lost went from 31 to 22.8. And then residential care, the costs, the claim costs, workman's compensation claim costs went from 177, almost 178,000 to 90,000. And then once again, the days lost from 49.8 to 24.8. Next slide. So just in summary, and by the way, at the end here, we'd love to hear from all of you about work that you've done in your own places of work, or if you have any questions, please share them with us. So in summary, the structure of the skin plays a key role in pressure injury susceptibility and development. The microclimate around the skin dictates the skin health and integrity. So that includes humidity, internal and external temperatures play a part. Pressure, shear, friction also affects skin depending on the microclimate. Linen technology is evolving to support and provide healthy skin environment. So we do encourage all of you to work with your linen supplier to understand the options regarding breathability, friction reduction, shear, stretch, and moisture wicking properties. And I'm sure many of you may sit on committees that make decisions about what kind of linen comes into your hospital. To include total cost, that's claims and lost workdays when evaluating product pricing. So it's not enough just to say these sheets are expensive. Encourage your place of work to look at also the total costs, including the workman comp claims and lost workdays. To implement a change, and identify interprofessional champions from various departments to work together. And it's not enough for nursing to do this. I found that the OTs and PTs, housekeeping and PSWs were key to help nursing change, because we love to protect our beds. And finally, to set goals and understand important metrics and track the outcome. So Kathy, I don't know if you want to turn it over to questions, or you can tell us the best way to proceed.
Yeah, so I think what we'd like to do is give two opportunities. You can either write a question in the chat box and I'll relay it to the speakers, or if you want, you can unmute your mic in the bottom left-hand corner and ask your question, and we'll open things up right now. Does anyone have any questions or any comments? I've got the chat box open if you want to type anything in. Anything you'd like to ask the speakers. We have Megan from MIP on as well. Are there any questions that you have for MIP? Okay, here comes. Could we have the literature used for these slides?
I think we referenced most of the statements there. So
yeah, and you can access it on CINAHL. Anyone that's an NSWAC can use CINAHL to access the references.
So we'll be posting the webinar in the member section, in the webinar section of the member site. So you'll be able to take a look at the references there, and then you can look them up. We have someone who has said, well done. Great presentation, by the way. Great information, Karen and Laura. We have challenges. Our It's R/T to the slider sheets and removing equipment under patients and continued use of soaker pads. Any suggestions on how to get buy-in?
Well, my experience as Laura speaking here, Nicole, it was key to get the interdisciplinary champions together. Nursing, as I said to you, my experience is nurses loved, they used to say, I have to protect the bed. And I said, the bed doesn't need protecting. It's it's got an impermeable surface. So I found that OTs and the physios in particular were essential. And what we did is work from unit to unit so that they would make their own decisions, and that's how we got the buy-in.
Thanks. I'll just say thanks, and I was going to type, but I always feel like I'm a police officer when I'm going through the long-term care facilities and acute care units that I work on, when I'm saying take that out, take that out. And I feel like I don't get the most positive reception, but yeah, that's great. Maybe we can include some of these people in our QI team meetings.
And Nicole, it's Karen. I think what
Hi.
Laura, how are you doing? Nice to hear your voice. I think I would totally agree with Laura. Like, you need to get your whole team involved and get the staff involved as well. So the PSWs or RPNs or LPNs, if that's what they're called in Newfoundland, and get them involved with you as well.
Thank you, guys. That was great.
Yeah, so we have a couple more comments. First of all, the person that asked for the references said, great, I can see the references now. And again, they'll be in the recorded webinar that will be posted. The next comment is really good. I hope some of my co-workers are watching. And the last one is a very neat new technology. I am excited to see the linen technology change and the pressure sensors. We also have another comment here. Any advice for the home care NSWACs in terms of getting the caregiver or PSWs, especially with limited PSW time visits in the home?
Oh, Mavis. Hi, Mavis. It's Karen. Oh, that is a very good question. I'm going to speak from personal experience with a family member right now who is at home, who does not want to needs to be in long-term care, but does not want to be in long-term care, is bedridden and incontinent and only receives PSW care twice a day. So she is in a wet incontinent brief for many, many, many hours. Luckily, the family has financing, so think about getting them to purchase sheets that have stretch, that are breathable. I know that in my own personal situation, we are trying to advocate with Lynn to get more time, but that is a battle that we are not winning. So I think we need to be really advocating for the Lynn for people just like this. And I totally understand where you're coming from, because I'm personally living with it right now myself. And so we're fighting the battle as a family with the Lynn to get more time, and then also getting the family to buy the right products. So Laura, do you have any suggestions? And
No, I think beyond what you said, Karen, no, I don't have too much else advice. It's a real fight and a real struggle.
Any other questions or any last comments? And don't be afraid to unmute your mic and ask your question over the webinar system. Any last comments? So I think that's looks like it's about it. So I'd like to thank both Karen and Laura again for all of the effort that they put in here. I have a comment here from Megan at MIP saying thank you to Karen and Laura as well for your work on this. It was very well done. And I totally agree. And I think that, you know, we need to be focusing more on prevention, and I think a very strong prevention message was carried in this presentation. So great presentation, and Karen Napier just sent a message, great presentation. And we really appreciate your time and all of your efforts. And thank you again to MIP for making this webinar a reality. So we welcome all of you to start attending our webinar series again in 2020. Our next one will be on the 14th of January on skin tears. So we hope that all of you will attend, and happy holidays to everyone, and please be safe. Thank you very much.
Kathy, it's Karen. We have a copy of the presentation as a PDF.
Excellent. So we can post that with the webinar.
That would be great.
Yeah, so I think I do have a copy. So when we post the webinar, we will post the file with the webinar.
Thank you very much, Kathy.
Yeah, and that way anyone who wants to access the references will be able to see the list. Okay, thank you very much.